And Dr. Tim Mihuc joins us now. Welcome back. It's good to see you.
Good to see you too, Tom.
This may be a surprise to a lot of people who have never heard about this ancient seagrass that's growing along Lake Champlain in the sand dunes at City Beach. Pretty amazing that it's that old and that maybe a lot of people have never heard about it.
Yep. Yeah, so it's the Lake Champlain as its own species of beach grass. There's another one called American beach grass, which is very common throughout the Atlantic coast and the rest of the Great Lakes. This one is particularly focused on Lake Champlain habitat and some sand dunes on Lake Ontario as well.
This may be something else a lot of people don't know. Lake Champlain used to be a sea. It was part of the Atlantic Ocean?
Yeah, it was we had sea ingression here 10,000 years ago, and when that sea went out, the Champlain Sea, that's when we formed the Champlain Valley. It became freshwater at that point. This seagrass evolved and moved in at that time, and that's probably how it became its own species.
And the city taking steps to protect and preserve it, is it that rare that there's concern about it?
It's rare in that it's only found in sand dunes, and there aren't a lot of sand dunes habitat left. Good news is the Elberg Sand Dune State Park in Vermont just expanded by nearly a mile of added shoreline to protect this kind of habitat. The Plattsburgh population is a fairly small population on a really good sand dune on the lake, though. The Plattsburgh City Beach is, obviously we all know, a very large, one of the largest freshwater beaches that exists. And that's because Lake Champlain has this long fetch and pushes all of that stuff right into the Plattsburgh Bay and creates that beach. And along with that creates the sand dunes.
And speaking of the lake, you're having a busy summer. SUNY Plattsburgh's Lake Champlain Research Institute has just been awarded a new grant by the Lake Champlain Basin Program to study microplastics in the lake. Tell us about the study.
So it's a joint study with the University of Vermont and involving Lake Champlain Sea Grant. And it follows on some work previously funded by Lake Champlain Sea Grant. Dr. Danielle Garneau at SUNY Plattsburgh had a number of studies addressing the plastics issue in Lake Champlain. This particular study is focused on the lake itself and then the beaches, looking for microplastics, trying to figure out where they are. Our goal is to figure out the distribution of plastics in the lake and on the shoreline, focusing on beaches in the more populous areas, Burlington and Plattsburgh, and try to figure out what's there in terms of plastics and what their distribution is, and then try to figure out if there's a way we can even track the sources of where those plastics are coming from.
And we've been reporting on this for a number of years with Dr. Garneau. When Senator Gillibrand was here in 2015, the summer of 2015, she introduced a bill to Congress that got passed, enacted, that basically banned the little tiny plastic beads from face washes and toothpaste. Plastic bags were banned here in New York State a couple of years ago. That's gone into effect now. So is this building on that to see if that's cutting down on the amount of plastics that are ending up in the lake?
That's a good question. So all the work we've done in the last few years has really been positive on how we deal with plastics as a society. The bag issue, New York is leading on that. The bans, as you mentioned, that have been enacted federally. This work really is just to ask what plastics are in Lake Champlain, what's here now, and where do we know where it's coming from. A lot of our early work is suggesting that what we're going to end up dealing with is a lot of what we call pre-production plastics. The word in industry that's often used for them is nurdle or pellet. And we are seeing those on the Plattsburgh City Beach. We see them, we're going to see them probably in other areas. And we have a rubber nurdle that's in Lake Champlain throughout the lake water column that we already know is there. And we want to sort of figure out its distribution. It is a little disconcerting to think there's a tiny rubber nurdle floating in Lake Champlain where all the forage fish are and all the plankton are, which are the base of the food web. But they're there. And so we want to sort of figure out their distribution and try to figure out where they're coming from.
We tagged along with you this week and you found some of them and you showed us. So they're in the water column way down into the lake?
So we have a different study going where we're looking at the lake vertically in terms of the structure of the biota and the plankton. And we're taking those samples, and in those samples, so we have depth-specific samples. We are seeing the nurdles deep down in the lake, 100 feet below the surface. They're semi-buoyant, so they're kind of just floating there, and they'll get to the portion of the water column where their buoyancy will take them, and then the lake currents will take them everywhere else.
And you mentioned no idea where they're coming from? Being rubber, is the thought they could be from breakdown from tires?
They look like the little nubs on tires when you get a fresh new tire, but I don't think that's what these are. These are, I think, the same as the white pellet nurdles that we're seeing on the beaches. They're pre-production plastics. They're going to be used in plastic industry. So industry brings in like huge bins of these small pelleted plastics, and then they use that to make whatever it is that they're making.
Now, you mentioned the small white pieces of plastic. When we went along with you this week, you found a number of those. That's troubling to you because you really don't know what they are or where they're coming from.
We know they're a pre-production plastic. That you can easily figure that out, but we don't know why they're washing up on the city beach, and they're there in fairly large numbers. We don't know if they're in the other beaches yet in Vermont and other beaches in New York. But yeah, we want to try to figure out what's going on there, and they're there in such large amounts that it's going to be a big part of our study to document sort of what their distribution is and try to figure out what the source is.
What is the thought on the danger to the habitat in the lake, the ecosystem of the lake?
Good question. So plastics in general are an environmental issue, you know, in the oceans, in the lakes, in freshwater, and everywhere. The problem with plastics is they don't really break down. They don't break down fast at all. So they're around for a long time. There are other issues with organisms consuming them. They're going to be an inert food item for those organisms. They're not going to get any nutrition out of that. And then really one of the third major issues is plastics they're made from oil. So hydrophobic compounds or hydrophobic toxins will attach to them. And so they can be a beacon for, like, say, PCB contamination and other things. Those molecules will be attracted to those surfaces of those plastics. So there's a variety of issues why we're concerned about plastics. Probably, to me, one of the biggest ones is it just takes forever for them to break down. So when we throw them out in the environment, they're not just decaying and going away quickly. And then we're just accumulating them on top of, you know, more and more and more plastics. It's not necessarily good for the environment. It's not good for the biota. It's not good for the ecosystem. So yeah, we are a little concerned that there are plastics floating in Lake Champlain in large volumes, and plastics showing up on beaches that are coming from, we don't know where they're coming from. And there's some concern there about what the impacts of that are and how that's affecting the ecosystem.
You've been working on this a number of years. You mentioned large volumes. Is part of this study going to try to determine how much there is in the lake?
Yes, so that's really the big part of our new study. We're going to take advantage of the Lake Champlain long-term monitoring program, which samples the lake and the rivers, tributaries to the lake. And we're going to use all those sites and look for plastics in every single one of those lake and river sites. And so that's a lake-wide approach. We're going to try to document the distribution of whatever's there throughout the whole lake, New York, Vermont, Quebec, everywhere. And then the beach study will be a little more focused on the urban beaches more closely associated with Plattsburgh and Burlington, but other beaches as well. Trying to figure out, you know, how prevalent are plastics on beaches, and maybe it's only certain beaches that are of great concern.
All levels of the food chain, from zooplankton to fish and other marine life, are you finding proof of the plastics within them?
And so Dr. Garneau at Plattsburgh has done some work on fish and other organisms feeding on plastics, and that it's not the major focus of our study, but I think we'll continue that work. And yes, she has found there are fish that are consuming plastics, and we are worried about the small little rubber nurdles in Lake Champlain and what's consuming them and what part of the food web they're entering.
Any concern about a threat to humans if they're consuming fish from the lake, or if they're getting their drinking water from the lake? Right.
At this point, we don't know the answer to that question. We know the plastics are out there. We don't know what level they're at, for instance, what kind of toxins they might have on them. That's where we might have some concerns for humans. If plastic pellets are accumulating PCBs and the fish are then eating them, we're going to have higher PCB loads in fish. We've not seen evidence of that in fish tissue PCB levels, so that's a good sign.
And your study goes how many years?
It's a couple years, 2 years of field work. So we'll do 2 years of intensive field work lake-wide and get pretty good spatial cover and characterization of plastics throughout the whole lake system.
We'll be interested to see what you find and follow up with you, certainly. You have other studies going on as well. The Research Institute is busy.
Mm-hmm. We are busy. We have a lot of funding these days. A lot of projects where we still maintain and operate our data buoys that were originally funded by Lake Champlain Sea Grant. We're adding some research studies to that, looking at the vertical structure of the lake at our buoy locations, basically looking at climate change impacts and storm events, how it affects the lake's vertical thermal structure. Anyone who fishes looks for thermal structure for particularly lake trout fishermen want to know the thermal structure to set where they're going to fish for lake trout. And that thermal structure gets disrupted by storms. And climate change is bringing us more storms, so we're seeing the lake change. And that has all kinds of potential impacts for algal growth, for increased nutrients, particularly phosphorus in the lake.
Tim Mihuc, thank you so much for taking the time to come in and talk with us. We appreciate it.
Thank you. It's good to be here.